We now come to motion number 5 on dangerous drugs. Minister Critchfield to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the Draft Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 Amendment Order 2023, which was laid before this House on the 5th of September, be approved. The order proposes an amendment to paragraph 1A of Part 3 of Schedule 2 to the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 in order to bring nitrous oxide under the control of that Act as a Class C drug. In September 2021, following increasing reports of the harms associated with its misuse, the Government commissioned the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs to undertake an independent assessment on nitrous oxide. The Government requested that the ACMD include in their assessment a recommendation on the appropriate legislative control of the substance. I'd like to thank the ACMD for the updated harms assessment they published in March 2023. Their work has been very helpful, and we're very grateful to them for the time they spend advising the Government on this and other issues. In their report, the ACMD did not recommend the control of nitrous oxide under the MDA, but they did note concerning health harms such as nerve damage. The ACMD also noted... Of course I give way.
I thank the Minister for giving away. On the topic of health harms, would he acknowledge that this amendment to this bill is actually just tinkering at a bill that doesn't address the health harms of drugs? And would he agree with me that a wider review of a bill that is half a century old is needed to really take drug dealers off the streets, to tackle sinister organised crime and to treat with compassion people with addiction issues?
Well, I don't agree that this is tinkering. I think this is an important measure, as I'll come on to describe in just a moment. And I think in terms of action against drug abuse more generally, there is a whole 10-year drug strategy, which we're 1.5 years into, which includes tough enforcement at the border. It includes action to disrupt criminal gangs who are dealing drugs. We had a very large number of record level of drug seizures just recently. And in addition to that, we're investing record sums of money in drug treatment. I think it's £582 million extra over a 3-year period, an increasing number of treatment places by 54,000. So I think there is a very comprehensive programme of work, both on enforcement to break drug importation and drug gangs, but also critically treatment to help people out of addiction and into a better life.
Can I thank the Minister for outlining very clearly what the Government's intentions are. This tonight is an amendment. It's very specific. It's a nitrous oxide, and I welcome it. I think Government have recognised, and the Minister has recognised the need to have those changes. With that being in mind, and with the intention of Government to push this, and some of this House, I think, will have an intention to divide. Well, I would very much like to see more stringent drug controls, and I think the Minister probably does as well. But for this amendment, can the Minister just clearly confirm one thing? That while this will not place more onerous on those who clearly need to use this, and I think of dentists and others and similar, can the Minister confirm that they will be okay and outside of this, but at the same time this need for this law is very clearly here? Thank you.
And yes, I can provide that assurance. I'll expand on this a little later. But those who are using nitrous oxide for legitimate purposes, which includes the catering industry, it includes the dental sector, it includes research, I think it even includes semiconductor manufacture, all of those legitimate uses and others will be outside the scope of these restrictions. He also touched on the point about controlling very harmful drugs more generally. Look, I think it is important to control harmful drugs, particularly where they're very addictive, particularly where they cause health harms. We've seen in some cities in North America, cities like San Francisco and cities like Portland and some Canadian cities, which have liberalised their drug laws very substantially, and that has resulted in wide-scale public health problems.
Honourable Member is going to bring up Portland at some point. There's been a clarion call to the extreme right wing to clamp down on drug policies, but you've got to look at Portland in its entirety. Yes, they decriminalised drug but they cut back drastically on all their support services. They also had a fentanyl crisis at exactly the same time. It created the perfect storm for the damage that has been done there. And we wouldn't like to undermine some of the good work that's been done there as well.
If you look at the way that the centre of San Francisco looks at the moment, it is not a very happy sight. The de facto decriminalisation of drugs and indeed failure to police certain criminal offences like shoplifting has led to disastrous outcomes, and I'm determined that we don't see the same in our jurisdiction here. But I do accept that treatment is very important, and that is why we're investing all that extra money in treatment. Madam, yes, of course, I give way.
Thank the Minister for giving way, and he talks about the problems in San Francisco, but would he agree with me that this legislation will also help to stop the havoc that nitrous oxide is wreaking in our coastal communities, in particular tackling the increased availability of these higher harm, larger canisters. Last summer, Southend Police confiscated 400 on one day. So I'd like to put on record this afternoon how much I welcome this motion and how much I thank the Minister for engaging with me and other members and listening to our concerns across this House.
Great. Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her kind words, and the campaigning that she did on behalf of her Southend constituents is an important part of the reason why we're moving this motion through Parliament today. And I can see the Honourable Member for the Wyre Forest in his place as well. I recall a Westminster Hall debate, I think just a few months ago, where he and other colleagues raised the harms that nitrous oxide were doing in their communities. And, sometimes people maybe wonder about the value of Westminster Hall debates, but I can honestly say that the contributions made by my honourable friend, the member for Southend West and the member for Wyre Forest and others were instrumental in bringing about this change.
I'm very grateful to him for mentioning that Westminster Hall debate. But would he also agree with me that it's campaigners like Dr. David Nicholl, who is an eminent neurosurgeon in Bromsgrove, who was responsible for raising this with me and many other colleagues in terms of trying to address the unbelievable harm that this does to children who think, because it's called laughing gas, it is amusing, but actually causes very, very profound neurological problems to those people who use it too much.
Well, my honourable friend is quite right to point to Dr. Nicholl's work, and I just thank him again for his campaigning on this issue, without which we possibly wouldn't be here today taking this through Parliament. And look, I mean, the evidence we've seen around the neurological damage caused by particularly large-scale consumption of nitrous oxide is very worrying. Neurological units around the country have seen cases of people who have been paralysed and suffered really quite serious consequences. Now, the numbers aren't enormous, but they are extremely worrying, and the severe cases, including, as I say, paralysis, are deeply concerning. So I agree completely with what my honourable friend just said. Yes.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I just briefly draw members' attention to my declaration of members' interests. I was, until recently, acting consultant addiction psychiatrist. Just on the point of other uses, legitimate medicinal uses and legitimate industrial uses of nitrous oxide, moving the nitrous oxide away from the Psychoactive Substances regulations to the Misuse of Drugs Act does put a number of limitations on its use in its current settings. Could I ask what consultation my honourable friend of the department has done in advance of bringing these regulations tonight with the medical sector as a whole, and also with other commercial providers or users of nitrous oxide?
Sir?
Thank you. Well, we have conducted further engagement and consultation with the ACMD and others in industry to understand the implications of this move. And it's jumping ahead a little, but we do intend to bring forward a further statutory instrument that will take effect alongside this one, that will make clear that the sale and use of nitrous oxide for legitimate purposes will not be in any way criminalised. It will continue to be permitted. And the definition of legitimate use will be very broadly drawn, because nitrous oxide is used for quite a wide range of both medical research and commercial purposes. So that definition will be extremely broad. We're not going to try and list them comprehensively. So a wide-based exemption for legitimate use will be brought into place to make sure we don't unintentionally stymie either medical research or commercial use for this drug. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's worth saying that the use of this is quite widespread. Amongst those aged 16 to 24, yes, I will.
Just a little clarity on that point about these two SIs, if I may. Does that mean that there's going to be a period in which otherwise legitimate uses will be illegitimate until the new SI is in place? And is the new SI needed because people came forward and said, whoops, you've missed this use? Not quite sure how these two are going to interact.
No, there won't be any gap, and it's not unintentional or inadvertent. It's just that we're going to have to most likely amend the way that Schedule 5 works in order to create this new category, essentially, to accommodate nitrous oxide. So the implementation of the two SIs will be on the same day. There won't be any lacuna or any gap. And it's just the way we have to sequence the secondary legislation under the 1971 Act. Let me return, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the question of prevalence. 230,000 young people inhaled this harmful substance in the year ending June 2022. It was the third most misused substance among that age group. And as we've discussed already, there is evidence that it has harmful neurological effects, particularly when consumed in quite large quantities. Beyond that, of course, we know that it has a significant effect on antisocial behaviour, and indeed it was through the Antisocial Behaviour Action Plan that we announced the measure that we are legislating for today. And I thank again colleagues in Parliament for raising the impact this has had on their community, fuelling antisocial behaviour, having an impact on the decent, hard-working majority who want to use their local park or go down their local high street without being harassed by antisocial behaviour or seeing the little silver canisters littered all over the place. And by the way, just to give an illustration of the scale of this, after the Notting Hill Carnival a couple of weeks ago, it is estimated that 13 tonnes of these silver canisters, nitrous oxide canisters, and others were collected by the clean-up crews from the street. That is an extraordinary amount, 13 tonnes. Of course, the giveaway.
How many tonnes of beer cans were collected?
Well, the honourable gentleman opposite will be aware that the consumption of beer does not, generally speaking, lead to severe neurological damage in the way that and paralysis in a way that the consumption of large amounts of nitrous oxide does. Yes, of course.
I think I don't wish to be disingenuous to the Minister, but the ACMD were very clear that they did not believe that the medical harms of nitrous oxide pose anything near the significance of many other drugs, street drugs, or indeed, if we look at the harms of alcohol-related brain damage causes much more neurological harm than indeed almost many street drugs do. And I think it would be helpful for the Minister just to correct the record on that.
Well, look,
Minister.
I think I've referred to the ACMD advice before, and the ACMD did note the anecdotal reports of severe paralysis caused by excessive nitrous oxide consumption, which I've referred to already. Now, on this occasion, rarely but not uniquely disagreeing with the ACMD advice, the government, as it is entitled to do, took a broader view and thought about the association with antisocial behaviour, thought about the fact that amongst 16 to 24-year-olds, it is the third most used harmful substance. And that is why we took the step we did. Of course, I acknowledge, as the honourable gentleman said, that alcohol can have an adverse effect as well, but we feel that in this particular case, the misuse of nitrous oxide does merit action, and many members of Parliament have raised concerns about the effect it's had in their own communities, and we are, at least in part, responding to those concerns which members of this House have raised. Now, nitrous oxide is currently regulated under the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016, but it is not, of course, currently an offence to possess nitrous oxide. It is only an offence under the PSA to knowingly or recklessly sell it, potentially for personal consumption. So by controlling nitrous oxide as a Class C drug under the Misuse of Drugs Act, it'll be an offence not just to recklessly or intentionally sell this substance for personal consumption, it'll also be an offence to possess it with the legitimate use exceptions that I mentioned earlier. And as I said, in response to an intervention, we will be bringing through a further SI to set out the definition of those legitimate uses, and those will be, as I said a moment or two ago, extremely wide-ranging to make sure we don't inadvertently stymie legitimate commercial, medical or research use. Madam Deputy Speaker, in summary, it's clear that drug misuse ruins lives, and in the case of nitrous oxide, it also contributes significantly to antisocial behaviour. The government has listened to the public, we've listened to parliamentarians who have been speaking for their constituents, and that is why we're taking this action today.
The question is, as on the order paper, Shadow Minister Alex Norris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Nitrous oxide causes significant problems in our communities. It's as we've heard, the third most misused substance among 16 to 24-year-olds. It leads to antisocial behaviour. The litter associated with it is a blight on our streets, parks and pavements. And we know from our own mailbags that our communities are sick of having to literally and figuratively pick up after the problems that nitrous oxide creates. We feel that what the government is proposing today is a relatively minor change to how we approach it, and we do not intend to stand in the way of it. But I do have a number of questions that I hope the Minister can address. Now, it has to be said, Madam Deputy Speaker, that as a psychoactive substance, nitrous oxide is already, of course, covered under the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016. So that means in practice that it is already an offence to produce it, supply it, offer to supply it, possess it with the intent to supply it, import it or export it on a similar basis. The only thing that isn't offence is the possession of it outside of custody. So that is, in practice, what will be different as a result of this instrument. So I would say, as I did at the beginning, I think that's relatively modest. I'm glad that the Minister has addressed the points relating to the Advisory Council on Drug Matters, because it is important that when the government diverge from what their independent advisers tell them, which they are, of course, able to do, that they explain why they do it. Our view on these benches would have been that we would have given greater weighting to the creation and impact of antisocial behaviour than the ACDM did in their report, and that's why taking action is reasonable. But they do raise other points that the Minister has covered to some degree, but I want to get some greater clarity on. Starting with the legitimate use of nitrous oxide, and we heard a couple of answers from the Minister originally that there would be no change, but later that there will be a follow-up statutory instrument to make sure there is no change. Those two things are slightly different. I think I heard him say that they will come into force on the same day, so there'll be no interregnum. I would be grateful for my clarity if he's willing to say that that is the case. The ACMD report also discusses a tighter definition of nitrous oxide so that lawful activities are not disrupted going forward. In the Minister's response to them, he seemed to be minded to do that. Could he say what the timeline might be for that? They also raised the crucial point about the move to from the 2016 Act to the 1971 Act, and that ought to be kept under review of its impact. Can we hear from the Minister that that will be the case? Because we do need to know that this is not going to excessively criminalise certain groups, especially young people. I'm pleased that in the impact assessment... I'll give on that point.
It is clear that the current Act of which we are discussing is vastly out of date and has many adverse consequences in its application. I wonder from our front bench if it would be a welcome thing that we would be able to commit going forward that Labour would review the use of that Act, update it, modernise it. I'm not saying scrap it, but definitely going forward we need to investigate its use, and that would give me some reassurances to be able to do what the front bench is asking later on.
I'm grateful for that. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint my honourable friend by not setting such a broad range of policy in a statutory instrument that's on a very narrow bit of policy. But I know that he will continue to make his case to myself and to my colleagues ahead of an election down the road. But I just wanted to address the point of the diversionary work. From what I understand in the impact assessment, for those who are likely to be caught in possession, it is a relatively small minority that the government envisage going on to charge, and instead others will go into conditional cautions, community resolutions, diversionary activities. I'd be keen for the Minister to state what he's based that assessment on and how he thinks that's likely to work in practice. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Minister, I think rightly, but very importantly, has coupled this issue with that issue of antisocial behaviour. So we have to have a reckoning of the broader record of the government on antisocial behaviour. Because they've had 13 years, the Minister talks about the Antisocial Behaviour Action Plan, he talks about the pilot programmes in 10 police forces. Well, that's less than a quarter of total forces. We've seen from the Minister and his colleagues a complete failure to reverse the cuts to neighbourhood policing. So we still have 10,000 fewer neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs than we did 8 years ago. Half the population say they rarely ever see the police on the beat. That proportion's doubled since 2010. And it's clear the government's plans are too modest to meet this challenge. So, I'll give way.
I should, by the way, welcome the Shadow Minister to his place. But would he like to join me in expressing pleasure at the fact we now have record ever numbers of police officers? As of the 31st of March, 149,566 to be precise in England and Wales, about 3,500 more than we've ever had at any time in history.
I'm grateful, Mr Deputy Speaker, for that intervention. I'm very also grateful for the kind words of introduction. As he says, I am new to this parish, but I would say that if I was in his seat, not mine, I might be a little less gleeful, as I say, about 10,000 fewer neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs than 8 years ago, and the fact that the people of this country that we serve are twice as likely to say they rarely see police on the beat than when this government started in 2010. I think there should be a point of reflection on that, perhaps, rather than the grandstanding that we saw. What people will ask is, and I think it's important that the Minister addresses this, so what are the non-legislative actions that are being taken alongside this to make sure that this instrument is effective? Turning to enforcement, this of course has important implications for our police. I'd be keen again to know the Minister's assessment of his overall readiness for those who are already busy, who will be asking to enforce this ban, and what training he thinks it will take in order for it to be effective. And again, we have to see this, see this record in its historical context to know where we're building from here. The government has weakened powers over the last decade. They've brought in powers that have not been used, such as the community trigger. They've abandoned the major drug intervention programmes that we left as a previous Labour government. They've slashed youth services budgets by £1 billion. They've let charges for criminal damage halve. We didn't hear from the Minister what are the sort of broader preventative actions he intends to implement alongside this instrument, again, to make it effective. We see in the report, the independent report, that standalone publicity campaigns are likely to have limited effectiveness. So what are the more thoughtful, community-level approaches that are going to be used? Because, of course, we have set out ours on these benches, a full comprehensive plan there. 13,000 extra neighbourhood officers and PCSOs, paid for by savings that have been identified by the Police Foundation, but which ministers are refusing to make. We would introduce new respect orders for repeat offenders, hotspot policing to tackle drug dealing, and strong action on fly tipping. Those are the sorts of things that we could align alongside the sort of decisions that are being taken today to make sure they're actually meaningful, because otherwise there is a risk that the Minister will have to reflect on, that people think that they are chasing headlines rather than chasing change. So to conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, we will not stand in the way of this instrument today, but it must be seen for what it is. It is a small intervention at a time when we need much bigger ideas. Thank you.
Kit Malthouse.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to you and grateful to the Minister for laying out the reasons for this SI, and obviously recognise the impact in communities up and down the land of this particular substance, not least both in littering and indeed antisocial behaviour. But I'm anxious that and I'm sure the Minister is as well, that if we're going to do this, if we're going to introduce this new measure, we should do it properly. And I had a couple of questions for the Minister about the impact of this instrument, particularly upon the criminal justice system. Looking at the impact statement, I am surprised, I have to say, at the relatively low number of individuals that are being, it's envisaged will be put through the system. Because as the Minister will know, if we're going to have an impact, there has to be a significant deterrent effect. And if we're going to have a deterrent effect, then there has to be a sense in people's minds that there's a very high probability of them being caught. And that when they are caught, there is swift and certain consequence. So could he just reassure us that the police are gearing up to deal with the numbers, even the relatively low numbers that are in the system, and that he has an ambition to go beyond these numbers? Because I know that he doesn't want to do something that's merely performative. He actually wants to have an impact on this issue, and we want to see fewer and fewer of these ampules on the street, and indeed fewer and fewer young people in particular using this substance. And if he hits his ambition, what impact is that going to have on the criminal justice system overall? I mean, he's talking about, I think, putting a total of about 500 people, I think the estimate is 500 odd people, in prison for possession of this substance. As far as I can see, that's quite small against the background number that's running into the hundreds of thousands, but nevertheless, that will have an impact on the prison system. The then thousands that will be going through the magistrates' courts obviously have an impact on that. And the police cost per capita of an arrest and charge and disposal of any kind, by my calculation, comes in at about £880, which seems quite light to me. So could he just reassure us about the cost, the capacity in the system, the ability for police forces to do this properly, and when this SI lands, that we are actually going to see some kind of action out there on the street? Because what I'm concerned we'll see is broadly what happened after the Blair-Brown reforms to cannabis possession. If you remember, the tail end of that particular period in our political history, the notion was brought in of a cannabis warning and then a cannabis penalty of 90 quid for police to hand out for pure possession. What happened was we saw a bit of a bump in numbers, and then actually it tailed off because the police realised that actually there was little effect. It wasn't very cost effective for them to do it, and the numbers have diminished over the years. Obviously, as the Minister will know, there was a white paper out last year that looks at a different set of consequences for possession, but in the absence of a response to that white paper, I'm keen to hear from him what the plan will be once the SI is in place, because as he and I both know, the policy is not the product. The product is what actually happens out there on the street. And we are holding out a promise to our communities up and down the land that they will see fewer of these ampules and less antisocial behaviour as a consequence. So I'm hoping there's an action plan. The second point that I had was just to ask about unintended consequences. One of the characteristics of my youth in Liverpool in the 1980s, or 70s and 80s, was the groups of young people gathering together to sniff glue. It was a horrible thing to do. It obviously had serious impact on their brains. The chemicals are even more noxious than this particular substance. And so how will he ensure that there isn't a diversion, if you like, towards those kind of substances and the resumption of glue sniffing in parks and playgrounds instead of taking this gas? If you could reassure me on both those points, I'd be very happy to support.
Thank you very much. Before I call Alison Thewlis, just to point out, members can see that there is a bit of interest in this. I'm not going to impose a time limit, but I do intend to call the Minister no later than 6:30, and if there are to be divisions, they will be when the Minister sits down. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it's pretty unusual that I come to a debate on entitled Dangerous Drugs, where I have direct experience of having taken some of those dangerous drugs, because I live a very quiet life. But to many women in this room, particularly, nitrous oxide will be better experienced as gas and air. and used under medical supervision, generally a very safe drug. Although my honourable friend from Aberdeen North will tell you that she had a collapsed lung as a result of her use of gas in air. So it's not something to be taken lightly. But whether or not it is a dangerous drug is something I would certainly dispute. Nitrous oxide, as the Minister pointed out, is not an uncontrolled substance. Non-legitimate use for psychoactive effects is currently controlled under the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016. And the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs points out that production, supply and importation is illegal if there is an offence to supply if the person knows or is reckless as to whether it will be used for psychoactive effects. In 2015, the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs did not advise control under the Misuse of Drugs Act. And in March 2023, they have advised exactly the same. So I'm very curious, really, as to why the Minister was so light on his reasons for ignoring his expert advisers, who have looked at this in great detail. We are hardly within the realms of evidence-based policy here, because the Minister has decided that he must do something, and this is something, and that's why we are here tonight. We don't dismiss the public nuisance of these substances. We've all seen the silver capsule littered in the street, a particular hazard to cyclists. I've also seen in parts of my constituency some of those larger canisters discarded as well. But all of this could be said for other drugs. As the honourable member from Brighton mentioned earlier on, we see beer cans littered all over our streets on a regular basis. In parts of my constituency, which the government does nothing about, you see syringes littered around the place because they don't want people to have safe consumption rooms to take their drugs. But somehow, uniquely, they seem concerned by the small canisters and the public nuisance of nitrous oxide. Nothing that the Minister has said today has given me any reassurance on that. He has talked nothing really about the issue of supply of these substances, because quite clearly they are being sold to people against the current legal framework, which is illegal. The Minister, very interesting to hear from the Minister in summing up how many people have been arrested, charged, jailed for supply of this substance under the current rules. Because if it is zero, the Minister has a bit of a cheek coming here asking us to carry out further legislation. What conversations has he had with social media companies? Because one of my members of staff, Vary Love, saw an advert on Facebook for this substance, for nitrous oxide, being sold online. So how many, again, prosecutions have happened for the supply of this in entirely illegitimate purposes, which would fall under the current legislation and be prosecutable? And I will take his intervention.
Thank you very much. The Honourable Lady makes a very, very important point about the fact that it is very easy to get hold of this stuff, and you can buy these little canisters in corner shops. You can also buy it by the pallet load for £18,000, which will keep an entire festival going for the weekend. But one of the important points about this, and she is right about the point about these people should be being arrested for supplying it, but it's also important to make sure that you limit the market to buy it. And if you create a clampdown on the market of people buying it, then that will dry up the supply.
I mean, that is not how the market works. We've had Misuse of Drugs Act for 50 years, and that has not stopped anybody taking heroin, cocaine or anything else. It is quite Moorish, and people tend to keep taking those drugs, and regardless of the legislation that is put before them to deter them, it does not work. What we need to do is go after those suppliers, and it does not seem to me that the government has any intention of doing that from what the Minister has said today. He's also talked about the broad legitimate use and the regulations he's going to bring for that. Without bringing that this evening, it's very difficult to see how effective that is going to be either, because if that legitimate use is incredibly broad, as it must be to allow people to continue to buy this for the purposes of running their cafe and producing whipped cream, then the Minister is going to find it very, very difficult to continue that enforcement game if this is the very broad use that he's bringing forward, and we have no sight of that tonight. So it would be irresponsible of this House to pass this SI, I would argue, without having seen the other part of this equation. The Minister hasn't talked... I will.
Is there not a danger that the broad uses clause will mean that good middle-class, white people with houses where they can consume this in private will be able to continue to do so, and poor, working-class, young people in parks, possibly predominantly BAME, will end up being criminalised, just like with many other of our drugs?
It is a legitimate question and a legitimate risk to this, and I don't see that in the impact assessment that the government has brought tonight. There's also nothing here to talk about the preventative actions that the ACMD talk about in their report. There is nothing about a public health campaign, about education, about the wider knowledge of the health impacts of this, which the ACMD recommend that the government take forward. I mean, there are things like B12 deficiency, nerve damage, incontinence and erectile dysfunction. The government is not promoting tonight a plan of how that information is disseminated to people. I also worry, and the neurologists who have written to the government with their concerns about further regulation and criminalising here, about the stigmatisation of people who have used this substance and then want to go forward and get support, because that will make them less likely to go forward. We know from the Misuse of Drugs Act that criminalises people and it dissuades them from coming forward for help, particularly to women. And the government has said nothing in their actions tonight in the impact assessment whether people are less likely to come forward for medical support for having used this substance if they are criminalised. Furthermore, there is nothing on here if it is an issue of younger people using this, of kids using this, what support services that the government intends to put in place to tackle addiction within that age group, particularly if it is a particular problem, and what is the government's specific response for addiction support for young people who have used this. The Minister had nothing to say on this whatsoever. And coming now to the position of Scotland within this as well. Now, the Scottish Government responded to the Government's consultation on the use of on the ACMD report on the use of nitrous oxide. And the Scottish Government have been crystal clear on their response to this. They say, and I quote, "The Scottish Government has and will continue to promote a public health approach rather than continuing the failed war on drugs. It is our view that banning nitrous oxide will further criminalise people for their drug use, serving only to heap additional harms on vulnerable individuals, our young people and communities, while doing little to improve the health of these individuals." And that point about health is absolutely crucial to this. Because there is nothing within what the government has talked about here around the health impacts of this and actually intervening on this. What they have outlined in their impact assessment is the cost of this. And they say in an incredibly vague paragraph on page 15, total costs across all monetised set-up and ongoing costs are estimated to be between 19.6 to 178.1 million, with a central estimate of 67.9 million over the 10-year appraisal period. That's an incredibly wide range of impact. And the government, again, are not explaining exactly why they should do this. They also say, at the top of page 19, there is limited evidence available to estimate how nitrous oxide misuse may change following the intervention. So they want to spend tens of millions of pounds and they don't even know whether this will have any impact whatsoever. Framing this under the Misuse of Drugs Act does not recognise tackling addiction as a public health issue. It is a public health issue. We cannot arrest our way out of a public health issue. It doesn't tackle the reasons why people are taking these in the first place, it doesn't tackle supply, and it doesn't tackle public health. The Home Affairs Select Committee just recently have concluded in their report on drugs that the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 and the Misuse of Drugs Regulations 2001 require reform. We recommend, the report says, that the UK Government reform the 1971 Act and regulations in a way that promotes a greater role for public health in our response to drugs, while maintaining our law enforcement to tackling illicit production and supply of controlled drugs. This here tonight does nothing about production and supply, it does nothing about public health. Mr Deputy Speaker, we're here tonight because the Government has decided that something must be done, and this is something. We on the SNP benches, we oppose this SI and will vote against it tonight. It criminalises people at unclear cost. There is no sense of tackling the source or reducing demand or treating this as a public health issue. And it is bang on form, if I may say so, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Labour Party are going on along with this unevidenced drivel this evening. In Scotland, we want to see a humane drug policy. We have a caring, compassionate, human rights informed drug policy for Scotland. We do not yet have the powers to implement this. And until such times as the Scottish Government has full control over all our powers as a normal independent country, we seek the devolution of drug laws in order to tackle these issues as a public health issue, as they should be.
Dr Daniel Poulter.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady, the spokesperson for the SNP in this debate, and I don't disagree with much of what she has said. I believe that the government will achieve very little through these measures this evening, except perhaps to cause considerable disruption to industry and legitimate medicinal uses of nitrous oxide. And I'm far from convinced from the changing reassurances that the Minister gave in that respect at the dispatch box. I'd once again, Mr Deputy Speaker, draw attention to to my declaration of members' interest, the practising NHS psychiatrist who was working until recently as an acting addictions consultant psychiatrist. And I have dealt with misuse of drugs quite extensively throughout my medical career. What I would say is that I believe in an evidence-based approach to policy making. And I believe that we have had this issue examined at the request of the government by the ACMD, and the ACMD very clearly suggested that this was not the appropriate legislative vehicle to deal with nitrous oxide. And they made, I will of course give way in a second, they made that recommendation for two reasons. Firstly, because we already have a Psychoactive Substances Act that if you want to deal with the illegitimate sale and supply of nitrous oxide, that there's legislation already in place to do that. And secondly, because we have other laws that can be used to deal with, for example, the unacceptable littering that sometimes occurs with some of the canisters that are used, that are involved with the recreational use of nitrous oxide. And of course I'll give way.
I'm very grateful for giving way. Is he aware that the ACMD was asked many years ago to opine on this, and they were chased up by two Home Secretaries in order to try and get a response from the ACMD on exactly this point? It wasn't until this SI was first talked about earlier this year that the ACMD actually did get around to actually answering the request from the government to make a judgment on it.
Yeah, I'm aware that it takes some time to compile ACMD reports, and the reason for that is because the ACMD likes to look at the evidence in the round, and there are a number of issues to look at here. There are the harms of use, and there is relatively limited evidence and data actually that actually would suggest that nitrous oxide is substantially more harmful than many substances that we use daily, like caffeine, for example. If you use caffeine to great excess, that has very profound immediate health consequences, and indeed alcohol. And the point was made by the honourable gentleman about the Notting Hill Carnival and the number of beer cans or other forms of rubbish that were left there. Well, if we look at the social and health harms of alcohol, which is a legal drug, and one that is misused legally, that is considerably more profound than what we're talking about here, or indeed when we talk about many other street drugs. And of course I'll give way.
I'm most grateful to him for giving way. Can he just clarify to the House what his conclusion is on this matter? Is he saying that he opposes this measure, or is he saying if this measure goes ahead, he wants the government to keep the matter under review?
If the House advises this evening, I'll be voting against this measure for further reasons which I'm about to outline to colleagues. So I think it would be helpful just to remind the Minister, in fact, of what the ACMD actually said in terms of legislation. And it said, based on its harms assessment, the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016 remains the appropriate drug legislation to tackle supply of nitrous oxide for non-legitimate use. There is, however, a need for enforcement of the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016 to be supported by additional interventions designed to reduce health and social harms. Based on this harms assessment, nitrous oxide should not be subjected to control under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 for the following reasons, and these are, I think, have been drawn out to some extent during the debate, but they're neatly summarised by the ACMD in their recommendations to the government in their report. Firstly, the level of health and social harms are relatively limited, and current evidence suggests that the health and social harms are not commensurate with control under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. Secondly, proportionality of sanctions. The offences under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 would be disproportionate for the level of harm associated with nitrous oxide and could have significant unintended consequences. And thirdly, the impact on legitimate uses, control under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, could produce significant burdens for legitimate medical, industrial, commercial and academic uses. The current scale and number of legitimate uses that stand to be affected is unknown, but is estimated to be large. And I think it was fairly clear that the government hasn't done a proper assessment or impact assessment of that before bringing this measure before the House this evening, and I will give way.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank my good friend for allowing me to intervene. Does that mean that the honourable gentleman thinks we should do nothing at all?
No, I don't think it means we should do nothing, and I think that if you believe, as I think a lot of us do, that we want to control the illegitimate supply of nitrous oxide, then we should look at existing legislation, which is the Psychoactive Substances Act, which was designed, and if that was taken through indeed by my honourable friend, the member for Hemel Hempstead, and this point was discussed at quite some length during the passage of that legislation, that the focus here was not about criminalising use, it was, and potential people who are using, it was about actually controlling the supply, and there was a very clear distinction drawn. What we've seen, though, is that there has not been, I think the Minister may correct this, but I think the ACMD made it clear in their report that actually better enforcement of that legislation would be, which already exists to control the illegitimate supply, would be a much better way of dealing with this, and a much more proportionate way of dealing with this issue at hand. And indeed, that is what the evidence more broadly that was supplied to the ACMD as part of when they were compiling their report also suggested. So there is already a legitimate means of dealing with this. But unfortunately, when we have potentially unintended consequences, and I'm not at all reassured by what the Minister said at the dispatch box earlier, that we'll be bringing another measure forward, which no one in the House is currently cited on, to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences. Well, actually, if you're bringing forward good legislation, you should bring forward both pieces of legislation together so that the House can consider them in the round. Now, my concern is that because the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 is primary legislation, is tightly drawn, that it is very difficult, unless you amend that primary legislation, to bring forward another piece of another measure that sits underneath it that is going to mitigate against what that primary legislation says. So I think that's something that I'm not reassured by the comments that the Minister has made in that respect. But in any event, it is not good government, or indeed effective government, not to put that measure forward for the House to consider at the same time, so that we can consider these issues in the round. So for those reasons, because I believe that there is already legislation in place that needs to be better enforced to deal with the legitimate supply, because I don't believe the government has given enough adequate weighting or consideration to the potential unintended consequences of this on legitimate uses of the nitrous oxide, and that was effectively admitted by the Minister in his opening comments by the lack of assessments that were made. I'm afraid I believe that the government is in the wrong place on this at the moment, and it would have been better to have actually brought forward a proper impact assessment on legitimate uses, put that alongside this before asking it to be brought to the attention of the House. So for those reasons, Mr Deputy Speaker, I will be voting against this measure this evening if it's called to a division.
Thank you very much. Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Sorry, I always seem to get that one mixed up. So, to my constituents, nitrous oxide is an irritant manifesting itself in the plethora of canisters that we see cluster in certain places, and seemingly in never-ending numbers, judging by the numbers that certainly I and my constituents collect on litter picks. But actually, to those who are the users of nitrous oxide, there is a far more serious side to this, and it seems to be obvious, actually, and picking up on I remember for Central Suffolk's comments that the actual powers under the Psychoactive Substances Act haven't been effective, because that's why we're here today talking about this. I come to a different conclusion to him, though, in terms of what we should do with this regulation. But we know from investigations that we've seen with the likes of Sky News that actually it is very easy to acquire this drug. They said it was as easy as buying bread, probably cheaper as well at the moment. Their investigators found that age verification was skipped. Balloons were offered in accompaniment to canisters, so there was no pretence at all that actually those sales were for legitimate purposes. And the ease and apparent openness about the intended use of the gas is astonishing, especially given actually that you can end up with a 7-year prison sentence for selling it. But when you've just got 31 and 49 reported convictions in 2020 and 2021, it's clear that actually it's a very, very tiny fraction of the transgressions that are leading to action. But more than this, it is failing the predominantly young people who are consuming this substance. It appears that the potential side effects of the drug are underappreciated. To many, it is considered harmless and short-lasting, but there is mounting evidence, particularly for those who regularly consume large amounts of the drug, and I've spoken to families of those who have been affected, that there are significant issues. Between 2001 and 20, there were 56 registered deaths involving nitrous oxide, most of which have actually taken place in the last decade. And while this figure is relatively low compared to, say, benzodiazepines, which have registered over 2,000 deaths in the same period, the fact that some of those heavy users have developed myeloneuropathy, which causes damages to the tract of the spinal cord and nerves, shouldn't be overlooked. And medical professionals have warned of a notable increase in numbers of people requiring medical interventions as a result of using the drug. Data released by the London Ambulance Service show there was an almost 500% increase in the number of incidents relating to nitrous oxide between 2018 and 2022. We've actually more than a tripling in the number of calls between 2021 and 2022. And if those trends in London are being reflected across the country, then I think we are in the middle of a very rude awakening about the consequences of the so-called safe drug. Certainly my constituent, whose son was admitted to hospital after rupturing his lung following inhalation of nitrous oxide, would attest to the need for there to be greater awareness of the risks of taking this drug. And she has certainly done her bit in highlighting her son's hospitalisation, but it really shouldn't be up to her to point out the dangers of nitrous oxide. And of course there is the impact that nitrous oxide uses has on those communities. As we've heard, it causes significant amounts of litter and environmental damage. Constituents are understandably fed up with having to see collections of small containers littered in parks and on street corners, and certainly in my constituency we're now graduating to the larger canisters, which are even more unsightly and presumably can cause far more damage than the little canisters. They're also actually, I think, fed up with the antisocial behaviour that often comes along with this, and actually there is a danger when people are driving vehicles having inhaled nitrous oxide, and that misuse when driving, according to the ACMD, accounted for 20% of the deaths associated with nitrous oxide in the last half century. So I do support the government's motion today, but I think there are some questions that have been left unanswered. Many other members have picked up on those, and I think that I know there are various options being considered for the licensing regime, which the Minister talked about, and I'm clear that just classifying nitrous oxide under these regulations without dealing with the licensing regime isn't going to be sufficient. It will just criminalise those using it instead of actually tackling the problem of those supplying the drug for the non-legitimate purposes, which appear to be the majority of sales. And those glaring loopholes have raised concerns. One of my constituents, whose family have been impacted by this, worries that this is a knee-jerk reaction from the government and not actually properly consider the views of healthcare professionals, addiction services and those with lived experiences. She also has concerns about unintended consequences as a result of this legislation. But I think that it would have been extremely helpful if we'd have full details of the licensing regime when we were considering this statutory instrument today, because I think that this is only going to work, this legislation is only going to work if we have a properly enforced licensing regime which is actually effective in dealing with non-legitimate sales. And I think certainly if we're going to support this, we need to be assured that there will be an effective licensing regime coming off the back of it. And of course we're cognizant of the fact that criminalising this substance must be accompanied by other measures such as increased community policing. The impact assessment states that investigation costs to the police have not been estimated, but surely if the usage remains as ubiquitous as it does now, it will have a huge impact on police resources, unless, of course, users are going to be given a free pass on this. And given thousands of kids are currently inhaling this without any police intervention at all, I do wonder what actually the approach is going to be about enforcement. unless we expect the cells to clog up. And on that point, I noticed on paragraph 58 of the impact assessment, it's estimated that between 8 and 63 additional prison places will need to be built. That does imply that there will be some enforcement action on this, and that does come with a price tag of between 2 and £15.8 million, which is not an inconsiderable figure. So I wonder if the Minister, when responding, could advise where these new prison places are going to appear, because it certainly, from the looks of this, looks like it's going to be leading to at least some people ending up in prison. But I think perhaps as well there needs to be a campaign to increase awareness of this new criminal liability, because obviously young people have been inhaling this without any consequences in terms of criminality, at least to date. But also I think that campaign needs to be accompanied actually by a better campaign on awareness about the dangers of inhaling nitrous oxide, be it criminalisation or hospitalisation. The people who see this as a bit of harmless fun need to know actually there are consequences for inhaling nitrous oxide.
Mike Penning.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I refer the House to my outside interests that are on the Register of Members' Interests. I bear the scars, Mr Deputy Speaker, I've been on the Treasury front bench when, in 2016, as my honourable friend alluded to a moment ago, when I brought the primary legislation through on what most people called legal highs or synthetic drugs. And we had many a debate, like we're having this evening, as to how far that legislation should go and what should be in it. And I learned an awful lot during the course of that primary legislation, because I took it all the way through, as to certain habits, put it this way, and certain uses of certain products. And we did discuss nitrous oxide. And I was comfortable at the time of nitrous oxide being exactly where it was until today. And I do agree with many colleagues on both sides of the House today that the enforcement that was envisaged when we brought that legislation through has not materialised in quite the way we would like it to have taken place. The corner shops that were selling legal highs, and as sadly there were some really, really tragic deaths because of that, and people being not only hospitalised but long-term hospitalised, and fatalities where loved ones lost their young children. So we had to bring that legislation through. I absolutely do. And alongside this legislation that we're talking about today, I think we should have more enforcement. I completely agree with, probably not from certain parts of the House, but I agree that there is more that can be done by local government, and the local government are asking for that powers to be done. But actually, my constituents are fed up to the high teeth of their parks and their streets being, frankly, turned into dumps. I have a beautiful park in my constituency. We have many beautiful parks, but Gatebridge Park, and I spoke to the gardeners only recently who are responsible for looking after it. And I was astonished when they told me the sheer quantities of these little capsules. We've got some degree of the larger ones coming through now, but these little capsules, which are not being produced, I don't think, I stand here for correction, not being for commercial use. They're being specifically manufactured by predominantly young people who think it is safe. That is massively dangerous. It is, I mean, when we had the debates back in 2016 on legal highs, that language was used to indicate it was safe. Nitrous oxide, or laughing gas, as everybody likes to use it, who wants to undermine the argument what we're making today, is not safe. It is dangerous. And there will be some people that use it and are perfectly, it doesn't appear that at the stage they've been using it now, God knows what's going to happen further down the line, feel that it's okay and it's not had an effect on them. But we've heard from the House this evening, and I've heard from my own constituents, where nitrous oxide has a devastating effect on their young children. And it appears that they're younger and younger that are using this product, and it's becoming freely more and more available. So I say to the Minister, I do support, and I will go through the lobbies and support this. But there are questions, legitimate questions that have been made in the House today, as to if we pass legislation, we have to actually feel that it's going to make a difference and it's going to be enforceable. I don't quite know how my police force in Hertfordshire are going to be able to enforce this. I don't know how they enforce the legislation which I'd actually voted against, which was smoking in your car if a young person... We all know that was right and logical, but it's almost unenforceable. And there have been almost no prosecutions. So, Minister, there's a lot more work to be done. You're going to have some of the scars that I had on my back through this. But actually, I think what we're doing is right. And going back to the advice, ministers get advice from many different places. From colleagues, from experts, from their civil servants, from their SPADs. But at the end of the day, ministers have to make a decision. And I think the decision that the Minister has made, and there will be work to be done when we bring the further secretary legislation through, and if we need to amend primary legislation around in the long distance future, and we've heard from both front benches that there's no intention to actually do that imminently. That will disappoint some people in the House this evening, but actually I think that's right, to concentrate on what we can do today in this House to protect our constituents and their loved ones, and I hope this legislation will do that.
As I said, I'm calling the Minister at 6:30, if not before. There's three members wishing to speak, so if you could all help one another so everybody gets in, that would be really useful. Ronnie Cowan.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I was delighted to hear that there were moves afoot to change the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, because if ever a piece of legislation needed changed, it's the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, followed closely by the 2005 Gambling Act, but that's for another day. There are so many things wrong with the 1971 Act. It was bad legislation in its day, and for over 50 years it has ensured that people are criminalised, stigmatised and ostracised. It has created divisions in society and led to unnecessary pain and suffering. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because that's what it was designed to do. It was never intended to provide support for those harmed by drugs. It was never based on compassion. It was never meant to address the issues around recreational drug use. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that in the last 50 years, things have simply got worse. Sadly, today, rather than righting some of the wrongs by decriminalising, legalising, rather than striving for DCRs, safe consumption facilities, naloxone provision, medicated assisted treatment, education and support, we've been asked to make matters worse. We've been asked to turn a blind eye to the evidence and learn nothing from the misclassification of cannabis, and instead we now want to persecute more people with the continued aim of arresting our way out of a drug crisis. It is widely acknowledged that given the many legitimate uses of nitrous oxide, enforcement will be a nightmare. And currently the Government has 3, I believe, licensing proposals, but is still in consultation over which to adopt. Maybe the Minister can clarify that in his response. Quite why we are pursuing the reclassification before we've sorted out the licensing is beyond me. But in the meantime, let's remove this regulated substance and create a marketplace for criminals to fill with who knows what. It's absolute bonkers. As Steve Rogers said in Conservative Home, empowering and enriching criminal groups will fuel violence and antisocial behaviour, not reduce it. Sure.
I thank him for giving way. I'm a bit sceptical. We're talking about nitrous oxide use as if it's a much harder drug. A lot of the kids taking this, certainly in Wolverhampton, are not hardened drug users. They are young people who don't think they're doing anything wrong. They don't hear about the medical risks. And this drug is so cheap and so widely available. Surely the government is doing the right thing in nipping this in the bud so they don't go down the road of getting into that, falling in with the wrong crowd and continually moving on to harder drugs.
And my point is, they're not nipping it in the not nipping it. What is going to happen here is going to hand over to the criminal fraternity, and kids that want to take drugs will continue to take drugs. Now we don't know what they're going to be taking, and it could be doing them more harm. Meanwhile, they're being arrested and given a criminal record, which will live with them for the rest of their days. So that's not helping the situation at all. So I was just going to say, this change will result in people being arrested and convicted. That conviction will lead to stigma and damage employment opportunities, housing, personal finance, travel and relationships. That's what we've been doing for 50 years, and that's been a roaring success, hasn't it? There is little or no evidence that says this action will address the... Do you want to intervene? No, just sit down there. There's little or no evidence that says this action will address the problem. Could the Minister provide me with one example over 50 years where arresting someone for personal possession and giving them a criminal record has helped reduce the misuse of drugs? Just one. And as has been highlighted already in this debate, the problems of antisocial behaviour and littering can be addressed through existing legislation properly applied. This change is driven by this government's desire to be seen to be coming down hard on crime. In doing this, they're ignoring the evidence from their own expert body, the ACMD, along with the Royal College of Medicine, the World Health Organization and the United Nations. The focus should be on education, not punishment. This change does nothing to address the question of why people fall into addiction or why people are taking drugs in the first place. It does nothing to reduce criminality. It just pushes it on to the consumer. It does nothing to make people safer. It creates a vacuum for criminals to fill. It's a wolf whistle to the Hang 'em High Brigade, and it's typical of the lack of long-term strategic planning that is required. There are no short-term solutions. No magic wand exists. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, and continuing to bolster a policy that hasn't worked for 50 years will only add to the misery and pain that has already been inflicted. It's time to think outside the box and radically overhaul this Act and make it fit for the 21st century, where drug harm is seen as a health issue and not a matter for the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Having had a Westminster Hall debate on exactly this subject a few months ago, I don't propose to take up too much time of the House. But I did just want to thank the Minister for listening to that debate, which I held some months ago, and actually bringing action as a result of that. I got involved in this as a result of being lobbied by BBC Hereford and Worcester and Dr David Nicholl, a Liberal Democrat councillor in Bromsgrove, who is a neurologist and who highlighted me to the damage that nitrous oxide does to kids. And he likened it to an electrical appliance having the insulation stripped off the wiring inside it, and then expecting that electrical appliance to carry on working. This is what it does to your nerves, and it is a huge problem for people who take this. There's been a lot of debate this afternoon about the fact that it's going to be criminalising people. It's going to be, we should be attacking the suppliers rather than the users. But at the end of the day, if you have something which is called laughing gas, which is told to be a sort of harmless drug, a harmless high, a safe high, actually it misleads people into thinking that it is a perfectly safe drug to take. It isn't a perfectly safe drug to take. It has profound implications on people's health. It's absolutely terrible. And the Honourable Gentleman in his earlier speech makes a very important point about the fact that we're going to be criminalising people. Ultimately, of course, some people will be criminalised, but is it not worth a small number being criminalised to act as a deterrent for the majority who go on?
Proved to be a deterrent. Look at the numbers we've got across the United Kingdom. Has arresting people and criminalising them ever been proven to be a deterrent?
No. Well, it's always very difficult to prove a negative. But look, I take his point. But I'm happy that we're going to be providing a deterrent for kids of the generation of my children, and that's what I really care about. So, as I say, I am incredibly grateful to the Minister for listening. I'm incredibly grateful to Dr. David Nichols, a neurologist, for giving me scientific evidence to support his campaign. I'm incredibly grateful to BBC Hereford and Worcester. But actually, with all of these things, we are reminded of particular communications that we have from constituents. And when I was preparing for my Westminster Hall debate, I received an email from somebody who wanted to talk about her brother. Her brother was a sportsman. He was doing incredibly well. He was possibly, I think, going to play rugby, for England. So a very, very talented sportsman. He was also a talented investment banker. I know we don't always like investment bankers, but he had a very good career ahead of him in the City of London. He found nitrous oxide. He thought it was a harmless high. Within a year, he had committed suicide as a result of the damage he had done to his system. I don't think it's right that if we know that this is the outcome, that we should do anything other than send a very, very strong message. This is a dangerous drug, and by criminalising it, it absolutely sends that message to try to put people off using it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm afraid I rise with great scepticism for this particular measure. Great scepticism because it is using an act that is fundamentally flawed. The 1971 Act does not work. It does not work in criminalising people. It does not work in reducing drug use or drug death or drug harm. And in fact, the evidence across comparative countries, particularly if you look at Portugal and other southern European countries, in fact, our Act and their current legislation, our Act increases the harm on people. It drives people away from getting treatment services. It drives people away from getting support. But I'm also sceptical about the slight moral panic, I'm afraid, and that's not to dismiss that there are some very marginal cases of harm that are horrible and acute for those that are affected by it. Death in its worst circumstance. We have caffeine deaths in this country, by the way, as well. Heart, lung and neurological problems. It's not to dismiss that. But as the Minister said himself, this is the third most taken wide drug in young people. But the harms caused do not even rank in the top 50 harms caused to young people. So the idea that this, I'm afraid, is a great drug of great harm is just not true. Most people use this drug. I have used this drug at the dentist. People will have used it in hospital settings. But most people use this drug recreationally, perfectly harmlessly, perfectly acceptably, and my view is actually perfectly fine. I haven't used it myself recreationally, but I have been in rooms where top judges, high court, where lawyers, where senior politicians. I have been in rooms where celebrities have used these kinds of drugs and other drugs, and it causes them no harm whatsoever. And the police do not come knocking at their doors, do they? Because it's behind closed doors by wealthy people, predominantly white people, predominantly people out of sight, out of mind, and the state doesn't mind. And what this legislation and classification will do is it will target poor people, young people. It will target predominantly people of ethnic minorities. And we know that's the case because that's what happens with all other forms of drug taking. All other forms of drug taking where there are large numbers of people from all different demographics of society taking those drugs, but the laws criminalise a specific certain set of demographics. And I'm afraid that's the problem with the fundamental basis of the 1971 Act. It targets people, it targets communities, and it doesn't help people get off drugs that they are addicted to, and it doesn't help people move to a safe space. And so this will make it worse. But it will not only make it worse in that sense, but it will also make it worse in terms of gangs, in terms of criminal syndicates. It should be no surprise, of course, the Conservative government giving get-out clauses to criminal gangs has been what they've been doing for the last 10 years in many other sectors, whether it be bungs to their mates or, legislation that allows dodgy dealings in all other sectors. But in this regard, what this will do is move this trade underground. It will suddenly mean a premium can be charged on this particular drug. It will mean that you don't know what's in the canisters safely. It will mean more deaths, and it will mean profits for criminal gangs. They will go laughing to the bank. The people that really want this are the gangs. The people that really want the continuation of the 1971 Act are the gangs. And I want the government, and I want my party, to stop being the cheerleaders of gangs, stop being the cheerleaders of criminals, because they are, while they continue to cheerlead for the 1971 Act. But also, let's look at the evidence. Let's look at the evidence of what the OWN Advisory Committee says. The OWN Advisory Committee says that this drug has no effect on crime whatsoever at the moment. There is no evidence that it causes crime. There is no evidence that it exacerbates crime. And there is some minor evidence that it has antisocial behaviour. Well, let me suggest to you that it's not really antisocial behaviour caused by laughing gas. It's antisocial behaviour because there are young people hanging around parks and benches with nothing better to do, because youth services have been slashed in this country, billions of pounds taking out of support services. It is people who live in miserable accommodation, who don't have living rooms to sit in because they live in horrible, filthy bedsits, who are out on the streets in the evening trying to while away the hours and take off the edge of their often miserable and difficult lives because they're in absolute poverty or they have other social issues around them and there is no one in the state to support them. That is what is antisocial. And yes, for the person in their nice big house who doesn't want to be disturbed in the evening, it's a bit of a frustration. But those things can be dealt with. They can be dealt with just like we deal with lots of other issues. And on littering as well, the same argument can be made. It is a reason, surely, to move to producer responsibility, where we make stamps and marks on the canisters, where we can see who is supplying those canisters, where we can ensure that actually suppliers of those canisters are then punished if properly. Many of my constituents think we should do that with plastic cups as well that strewn our beaches and we don't know which bar has given them out and doesn't pick them up. I agree with that. I agree that for waste and recycling we need to move to a completely different model. But it is not a model of criminalising young people. And this is criminalising young people because the only change here is to criminalise young people. So if there was a way to stop this being produced, if there was a way to ensure that people can enjoy themselves, and I don't have a problem personally with people enjoying themselves with drugs, but to do it in a safe way, to do it in a way that doesn't cause antisocial behaviour, I would be all for it. But I'm afraid all this does is exacerbate the situation. All this does is make it worse. Personally, I would like to not have a vote on this today because I think it would be better for the government to go away and rethink. We've got cross-party opposition to this and to find a way forward. If there is a vote, I would very reluctantly not be able to support the government on this, I'm afraid.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's been an interesting and wide-ranging discussion, and I'll try and conclude relatively briefly. Let me start by thanking the Shadow Minister for his, in principle, support for this. It's good to start off on this note of cross-party consensus, which I hope will be continuing for the remainder of his tenure in his new role. He did ask some questions, as did the member for North West Hampshire, about plans for enforcement and for the resources that will be dedicated to this. And I can confirm that this is something we expect the police to be focusing on. He asked about the antisocial behaviour action plan. It's true we are starting with pilots in just 10 force areas doing the antisocial behaviour hotspot patrols, but in April of next year that will expand to all of the 43 police forces across England and Wales, backed by around about £43 million of extra new funding to make sure those ASB hotspot patrols are out and about, dealing with antisocial behaviour issues more widely, but specifically also looking at this particular issue of nitrous oxide consumption. In relation to questions around prison places, we're in the process of building about 20,000 or more, over 20,000 extra prison places, but we do expect this to have a significant deterrent effect, both on the consumption of the drug and, as the member for Wyre Forest said, by reducing the consumption, it'll reduce the incentives to supply this drug as well. So we do expect this to be enforced. I'd like to pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Hemel Hempstead, for his work in legislating the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016. Some people around the House asked about the action that followed, and I think my right honourable friend can take some pride in the fact that I understand that 332 retailers stopped selling psychoactive substances as a result of his legislation, and there have been, that I'm aware of, at least 230 prosecutions under that Act, which of course covers nitrous oxide. I think I may have said earlier regulated nitrous oxide. The more accurate term would be to say that it covers nitrous oxide. Now, some debate occurred this evening around the ACMD, the Advisory Council for the Misuse of Drugs, and I'd like to put on record again my thanks to them for the work they do advising the government. The government does almost always follow their advice. Not quite always, though. There have been occasions in the past, including actually the previous Labour government as well, where the government just takes a slightly broader, slightly different view. And for the reasons that many members have outlined this evening, the member for Wyre Forest, the member for Ellesmere Port and Neston, and indeed the Shadow Minister, we have taken a slightly different view, taking a broader view, considering the social harm, having regard to the fact that we're worried that the harm, the paralysis this causes, may get worse if use is allowed to spread. We have taken a slightly different view, but we have also consulted the ACMD on how we're going to go about implementing this. We've done a public consultation on implementation, and the report was published on the 5th of September, making clear there will be a wide-ranging exemption from legitimate use. And some members have asked about that. We're going to do that by amending the Misuse of Drugs Regulations 2001, and we're going to make clear that a legitimate use is any use that does not involve inhalation by a human, and inhalation by a human for research and medical purposes will, of course, be lawful. I hope that gives a little bit of extra clarity, which some members have asked for. And look, in relation to people who consume this medically, a couple of members have referenced that. Of course, when people consume nitrous oxide at a dentist or in the context of giving birth, they are being supervised by a medical professional. In the case of giving birth, typically an anaesthetist is supervising the administration of this drug, which is necessary because it is potentially very harmful. Mr Deputy Speaker, there's been a few comments about the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act more widely, which I don't propose to go into in detail, save to say that if you look at jurisdictions, San Francisco being an example, where they have essentially taken an incredibly permissive view, that has not resulted in more people going into treatment. It's led to a significant increase in deaths as a result of drug overdoses, particularly from synthetic opioids, and it has led to wide-scale disorder on the streets of San Francisco. So I don't accept this thesis that you can only have treatment if you liberalise drug laws and have out-of-control public consumption, as there is in some American cities. We don't want that happening in this country, and that is why a combination of going after drug supply at the border, going after criminal gangs is important, combined with funding treatment, which we're doing, an extra £582 million on treatment over 3 years, combined, of course, with record police numbers, 149,566 more police than we've ever had before. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, the measure we're, I hope, going to vote through this evening is going to help us combat antisocial behaviour across the country. It's going to protect people from the medical harm this drug can do, particularly young people, but adults as well. And it is a critical part in this government's battle against antisocial behaviour, and I commend these regulations to the House.
The question is, as on the order papers, may that opinion say aye? Aye. The contrary, no. Division, clear the lobby. Order. The question is, as on the order papers, may I say aye? Aye. Or the contrary, no? No. Tell us for the ayes, Amanda Soloway, Faye Jones. Tell us for the noes, Kirsty Blackman and Hannah Bardell. Members could resume their seats. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 404. The noes to the left, 36.
Thank you very much. The ayes to the right were 404, the noes to the left, 36. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock.